point, when Wall Street, the investors are very analytical, we're not looking for the typical investor. We're looking for an affinity group. And that's what we made. Bill's got a huge affinity group already. We're going to build one. That's what part of this is all about. And people aren't, we'll target those people. We don't care about the other 95%.
Okay, I mean, I think that makes sense, but just in terms of, if you're looking at an IPO typically, especially within the biotech space, so I work with lots of biotechs in the San Diego, San Francisco area, and typically they'll have assets at least in the phase 1, phase 2 arena before they're even looking at possibly going public. And it takes an incredible amount of money. I mean, I know that we're probably talking about maybe several $1 million. I mean, that's enough maybe to get one asset to a phase.
That's a real IPO as opposed to a small cap IPO. Or
okay. So this would be something that's traded in terms of.
Yeah, you could acquire a shell. I mean, you could do all kind of deals. You could get one just for stock and sometimes money, but it's really inexpensive. In fact, there are some companies they're called BDC, business development companies. So there are ways to do that. But the interesting thing about going public is the big concern about being a public company is having your stock hit, people selling. If we had people who are not the typical investors, but a big base of smaller investors and big investors who are holding stock for other reasons, we're not going to have that selling pressure. We shouldn't have it.
So is there an interest to actually create an institution that funds this, or is it an interest in actually looking at technology and actually funding the technology? Because we most definitely have the technology out there. I mean, if you look at...
It sounds like it's an incubator. I was going to say,
yeah.
I'm very familiar with what Bill Gross did with Idea Lab. And the way that they had as a structure, and it's interesting because Idea Lab has had several different lives. Oh, sorry. Idea Lab has had several different lives. Their most successful one was actually the one with the least money. And Bill Gross, who's a successful serial entrepreneur, he had made some money in a kid software company, and then went and took some time off, laid on the beach in Hawaii, and thought up all these ideas. Literally, all of the ideas of Idea Labs were Bill's ideas. And he then would say, okay, I have a great idea. I'm going to go and find people who are good operators, and of course this works more with software than it would with this area. And I'm going to give them $250,000 apiece. And this was in 1996, I think it was. And basically, he said, you get the $250,000, and if you go and reach benchmarks where I can then go out and show what benchmarks you had, I will find VCs to put $5 or $10 million in. If you don't, and it's your mistake, have a good life, and you're never going to work for me again. If it's the idea's mistake, but I think you did the right things, I'll give you a different company to run. And so he raised $5 million privately from well-known investors. Steven Spielberg was one of the investors, and a gentleman who was on the board of AT&T. So that was credibility. No legality involved at all when you raise from that kind of level of people. It was a mere $5 million. From that $5 million, they had eToys, which was a multi-billion-dollar IPO, which then tanked, but was a multi-billion-dollar IPO. Overture, which became, essentially one of the biggest assets of Yahoo and was an over $1 billion IPO, and CitySearch. So of the 20 companies in $5 million, they created what was eventually several $1 billion in worth. They then went and raised $1 billion on a $7 billion valuation at the top of the bubble to then reinvest in these same companies, and then lost a lot of it. But they still have a lot of it left, and now they're using that excess to fund new companies. But the really good model for that time of the market, and the question is, how much do you need to raise to actually have a difference in these companies? Can it be $250,000 a company, or does it have to be $30 million a company? That's the thing. That'll determine your structure.
Just to prove how very small the world is, one of the companies that Bill Gross was involved with in that, with Steven Spielberg, was also led by the guy with whom I started the Methuselah Foundation, Dave Goebel. So there's also connections to the longevity.
I think one of the things that we need to focus some attention on is lumping all the anti-aging strategies together because you mentioned the biotech model. The biotech model, a lot of it, is based on the idea of producing a drug, selling the drug, and making a lot of money. That's because the big pharma model is the model that you're working with. And everyone, you look, resveratrol would be like the poster child for this. It's like they had a good idea, they managed to get some initial funding, they started the company up, they proved the idea out, and then it got sold to big pharma. And resveratrol is going to be a very, very big drug for the next 20 years until the patents run out. Now, in terms of short-term returns, you've got 30 companies at least currently pushing stem cells. And they are, some of them have to go through clinical trials, because if you're going into the body, like stem cells into the heart, then if you do it without getting the FDA involved, you're in trouble, if you plan to be big anyway. However, the company like Regenex, which is in Colorado, is a couple of orthopedic surgeons that started up a clinic in Colorado that basically takes your existing bone marrow out, very old technology, takes that, grows up some cells in the lab, and injects them back into joints that are aging. And they're charging $5,000 to $7,000 a crack, and have treated several thousand patients, I think. So that doesn't require the long lead time that a drug development process requires. And those are available now. As I mentioned yesterday, there are 2,600 clinical trials going on for stem cells. Now, something like treating balding or graying or, those types of things could, if done properly, probably escape significant FDA attention. Because I don't think, was Bosley the big hair company? Bosley? That's doing hair plug transplants. I don't think they've ever been approved by the FDA. And so you could immediately have applications of those. Then you've also got to consider that if you've got the technology that can prove out pristine stem cells or some of Michael West's technologies for growing, and I'm sure he's working on these things, stem cells that can be turned into other kinds of stem cells. That work has preliminarily been done and can easily be turned into therapies now. As you say, your entire, readership that is already concerned about this, they don't have to be sold on it. They have to be told where to go, even if it's a clinic offshore, to be able to have these procedures done. So you don't want to lump these two models together. On the other hand, there are other things like some of the drugs Aubrey wants to do, or what would effectively be a gene therapy, and then some of the other cases where they're trying to find new telomerase promoters. Those kinds of companies have to be dealing more with the new drug model, because you're going to have to go through standard approval processes if you want them approved in the U.S., or you have a strategy involving doing them offshore or finding some new country that you create where, and it'll take 2 or 3 or 5 years for the Postal Service, the FDA, and the U.S. government to try and figure out why these packages are all coming from, Island Co. Inc., Okay. And if you're clever, you might even be able to get Larry to loan you his yacht because he can't figure out any place to park the damn thing.
Yeah, maybe Bill can start his new country on Larry's yacht. I think that would be a... So I just wanted to follow up what Robert was saying, because I think that it's very important for us all to remember that the reason why this meeting has, from a scientific point of view, been so varied, has covered so much ground, is that there is a requirement, if we really want the result that Dave started this whole thing in order to get, and that Bill and Saul and everyone here is interested in, namely very dramatic postponement of age-related ill health, we're going to have to do a comprehensive job of it. We're going to have to do the low-hanging fruit, the easy things, and we're also going to have to do the things that are less far along at the moment and are going to take longer to develop. So I think it may be important from a commercial point of view to build into any structure that one was presenting to investors, the bridge concept really, the Kurzweil bridge concept that you're going to get the best bang for the buck in the end by focusing not on one or other of the short term and the long term, but by doing both in tandem. And if the structure of such an entity could be built in such a way as to encourage that, to actually make it in the financial interests of the investor to actually spread their investment across the short term and the long term, then I think we would be maximizing the effectiveness of what we were doing from the point of view of hastening the final result that we're looking for.
This is clearly a very fertile idea, which we initially discussed at lunch, and it's gotten more interest than any other idea that's been discussed so far. And So there's a general consensus that some sort of company might be a good idea to start. The details, there is not a consensus yet. I personally like the idea that was presented a little while ago about possibly purchasing an existing public company, but there are many possibilities here. And what I mainly am suggesting now is that we still have maybe a couple more hours that we can discuss this, and that we have another meeting fairly soon, which would include some of the people in this room and other people who are not in this room, and we can really get down to brass tacks and maybe even lead to the formation of such a company or the purchase of an existing company at that time. And so that's pretty much all I have to say.